What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to be a conscious individual? How do we understand and define what consciousness actually is? And where in the world could consciousness come from? Well, these are just a few of the very heady questions that Josh Rasmussen tackles in his new book, Who Are You Really? Let me tell you what I thought. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, I have here a copy of Who Are You Really? By Joshua Rasmussen. I think I'm pronouncing that right. A professor of philosophy and at Azusa Pacific. And I want to say thank you to IVP for sending me a copy of this book for review. So I'm going to dive into it. This is a heady one, but I'll go through my typical format of my main idea, the research behind it, the readability of it, and my reaction to the book as a whole. So, Who Are You Really is, in one sentence, if I could define it in one sentence, it's an exploration of consciousness. The so-called problem or mystery of consciousness that kind of plagues philosophical pursuit. So that's really the core kind of driver of the book is an attempt to rigorously unpack the question of consciousness. Consciousness being in this specific kind of philosophical sense of that word. That's something that seems to be unique to humankind. Unpacking what does it mean to be conscious? What is consciousness? And kind of who are we as people? How can we understand our identity as humans, as conscious beings? And then the second half of the book gets into some of his proposals as to how he understands what conditions from which consciousness, as defined in the first part of the book, what kind of conditions would have to exist for something like consciousness to emerge. So deep stuff, if that's not clear yet. And that's a really, I feel like that's a woeful attempt to try to summarize what's a really incredibly deep and thoughtful book in just a few sentences. So that's the main idea. Trying to inquire and discover, pose some ideas about the nature of consciousness and where consciousness could potentially come from. The use of the word emerge there is intentional. Quickly on the research and the readability of it. First, the research of this book. I had not read anything by him. I'd heard his name. I've known of some of his book publications, but I otherwise was not terribly familiar with him and his work. And so I have to say that the research in this book really impressed me quite a bit, because it's very, very clear to me that Rasmussen is a serious philosophical scholar. So the majority of his citations and footnotes are academic, journalistic kind of publications, and there's a lot of them in here. And there's also a lot of he cites a lot of monographs and books and stuff, but it's a lot of more of kind of periodical, academic, highly peer-reviewed academic, serious heavyweight scholarly stuff within the philosophical realm that he pulls on, and he's clearly extremely conversant with all kinds of philosophical ideas from this world of writing. And I'm someone who reads. I read a good bit. I would say about kind of more. I read more books than average, you could say. And I was relatively unfamiliar with a lot of the stuff that he cites because it's a lot of this super academic stuff. And I do not read journals, really. I rarely read journals. So all that to say, the level of kind of serious scholarly weight in the citations and the research was really impressive to me, and it's very clear that he's a serious philosopher. He's a serious philosopher in what I would say is more of the analytical style, the analytical vein of philosophy, which leads me to the readability of this book. And I'll put a little bit of my cards on the table. I tend to be a person who struggles with the more analytic style of philosophy. And if you're familiar with those broad generalizations of analytic and continental, as difficult as things are to really put in just those two categories, those are shorthand terms that people use for kind of styles of philosophy. I tend to just enjoy the continental style, you could say, quite a bit more. I tend to read a bit more in that when I get into philosophy. I tend to struggle personally just with the stylistic kind of approach of the analytic type of philosophy. I struggle with that. I tend to, it's very, the good analytic philosophy is extremely rigorous, extremely dense, extremely careful in its argumentation, and a very, very logical step-by-step kind of process. and that it's very valuable. I just tend to struggle with it, and I'm saying all that to say that this I would put in that category, in that vein. It is an analytical approach, and analytical approaches tend to be a lot of, here's a proposition. If proposition is true, here's an implication of that proposition. If it's not true, here's another implication. And if neither is true but this other one is true, here's an implication of that. And it tends to like really step through those kinds of analytic style, logical style kind of argumentation. And this book is that. However, I will say, as someone who struggles with it, he does a much better job than most in that vein of making it more approachable and more enjoyable to read. He does a lot with anecdotes. He does a lot of highly readable analogies and metaphors. He has this through-line image of kind of pressing further and further into a cave or a cavern that helps at least give you a handle on kind of the progress of the argument. So he does things stylistically here to make it more approachable. But that said, I still wouldn't say this is a super readable book. I wouldn't necessarily give this to the uninitiated reader in terms of philosophy or analytic styles of philosophy. It is a little slower going, but it is much more approachable than some others in that style that I've read. So that's a little bit on the readability of this it's a very rigorous philosophical text, which leads me into the final thing of my reaction to it. So given some of the readability things I just talked about, it was a little bit of a slower going thing for me. I was surprised by this book on a few accounts. First of all, Rasmussen is a Christian philosopher, and he's at a Christian school. I was expecting maybe a little bit more of an apologetics or a popular apologetics style philosophical argument here, and that's not how I would explain this book. It really doesn't explicitly posit like a theistic. I mean, these are things that are hard to pin down with philosophical language and labels, but I would say this book is not. It's not a like full-throated, explicit Christian theistic defense of a philosophical argument. It's a very, very rigorous and careful and extremely conversant in all those areas of research I talked about earlier. It's a very careful philosophical argument for his understanding of how to think about consciousness carefully, and then also what implications that might be for the kind of world we live in which consciousness could emerge. And all those things, you can put down the book and you can see how it leads, at least him, towards a philosophical view that certainly is built upon theism or the Christian God. You can see that, but it's not like a full-throated explicit claim in this book. And I gotta say, I was surprised by that, but I was pretty impressed by it in the sense that this is a book that I think deserves serious consideration from any of the philosophical-minded reader, whether you're theistic, atheistic, Christian, or whatever, or not. Any person, and this is, I suspect this might be by design, because I'm wondering if he's a particular kind of bridge-building philosophical thinker right now, but trying to build bridges between theistic and atheistic camps. This book, I think, can and should be read by anyone who wants to be a careful thinker in these subjects. And I don't think you're going to be put off if you are a committed materialistic, atheistic kind of philosopher. You're not going to be put off by the argument in this book because of the way he handles it so carefully and so thoughtfully. So super impressed by that aspect of it. Now, to the actual kind of core argument of the book, whenever I evaluate something like this, like I'm a big reader, but I'm not philosophically trained, so I feel like I have limited tools to like analyze the merits of the philosophical claims being put forward. What I can say is I can evaluate how they strike me as someone who reads a lot and can compare it to other arguments, and I can analyze kind of the style of it and the success of it as a book that puts forward an argument for the kind of reader that I am. And I would say overall this is a very successful book, extraordinarily thoughtful, and it pushes you pretty hard into some deep, deep, deep reflection at points that some chapters are head spinning and the stuff that they really push you to think about, and other chapters they're powerful. So one chapter in particular, in the first half of the book, he strips away, it's kind of a deconstructive section of the book where he strips away layer by layer the things that we tend to popularly think we are when it comes to our consciousness and our identity. So he strips away the layer of your feelings, he strips away the layers of your thoughts, your body. He kind of strips all that down and argues why those can't be you in terms of the core identity of who you are. And the chapter on your will, the chapter on your agency, how that's actually not your identity either. I thought that was a really powerful chapter and not something that I'd really thought about engaging with before I read this book. And the experience overall of stepping through the cave, as he puts it, and pulling back layer by layer by layer, it's a very powerful extended reflection that pushes the reader into some areas that you probably, if left to your own devices, you're not going to really meditate on or reflect on. And so that's an incredibly valuable exercise if you can stick with the analytic style that he takes. And the end result is a really pretty powerful experience of thinking at the end of that section of the book, like, well, what am I then? And so it really can push you into some pretty deep introspection. And introspection is a key tool he uses throughout the course of the book, and introspection plus a scientific kind of an emotive analysis to get at this question of who we are. And then the second half of the book I found very helpful, I think probably a little bit less personally impactful than the first half of the book for me. But the second half of the book in which he starts to turn to say, well, here's an understanding of the world that could posit how consciousness, like what I've just defined, could emerge. It's super interesting, a little bit less personally kind of a powerful experience for me to reflect on myself. But the end result of reading this book is a serious paradigm stretch, serious introduction to a lot of philosophical concepts in this whole conversation that's kind of roiling right now in the world of philosophy about consciousness and who we are and who we are not. And the origins of all of these things. These are deep questions, really crucially important questions, and this is a book that I think wades fearlessly, courageously right into the thick of all those conversations, makes them for the most part pretty accessible for the uninitiated reader, and leads to some really powerful philosophical reflections to that reader. And also, I think, is a very winsome book for anyone who's philosophically minded, whether or not you're a person of faith or religious or not. So it's a pretty remarkable book in a lot of ways. Not always the easiest to read, but extraordinarily thoughtful, well-researched, and well put together, I would say, if you're willing to do a little bit of heavy philosophical lifting in an analytical style. So there you go. That's Who You Are Really by Joshua Rasmussen. It's hard for me to give just a simplistic recommendation, but if you are intrigued by what I just described, if you are willing to do a little bit of slow, careful reading and serious thought and reflection, then man, oh man, this would be a really great book to add to your shelf. And I would strongly encourage, even if you're not a Christian, to wrestle with it, because I think it's a really brilliant, really brilliant piece of writing. So there you go. That's my thoughts on this new book from IVP. Thanks again, IVP, for sending me the copy, and thanks to Joshua Rasmussen for putting so much thought and care into this piece of writing. So thank you for watching.